Did you know there's no provision in our COVID-safe plan for mass circumcision ceremonies? But I've checked with Glenn and his flint knives are sharp. He's available for house calls. We should probably pray. Lord, as we look at this passage, it's a long way from our day-to-day experience. Please help us to understand what it meant for the Israelites as they entered Canaan and what it might mean for us today. Amen. So can you imagine yourself in the place of one of these Israelite men? The word passes around the camp what Joshua has planned next. I am male, I am 34 years old, so I suppose I fit some of the demographics. Thousands of years, thousands of kilometres, it's still uncomfortable, even from this distance. So who were these guys and why were they willing to do that? If we take a prototypical Israelite guy, if it helps, you can call him Michael. He's 34 years old. He would have been born 6 years into the time of wandering through the wilderness. He never lived in Egypt. Thoroughly a nomad. Never known any other life than hunting and gathering, setting up camp and breaking it down again. And they know their role in that society. They've found their place by that age. They've probably got a family. They've got whatever the equivalent of a career is, they're established. But there's a sense that they have that this really isn't what they were destined for. The idea has always been to find somewhere to put down roots. But there's a stigma hanging over them from their time in Egypt. They've always been seen as escaped slaves. And there's probably a nagging worry that Pharaoh could find them wherever they settle, and they embarrassed Pharaoh. He might want to make them pay. So, where do they turn to find a new identity? We all have stories that we tell to explain aspects of who we are and why we are where we are. For the Israelites, wandering in the wilderness, a big part of that was Egypt, of course. They had stories passed down from their parents about the hardship of living in slavery in Egypt. Probably about some of the amazing things they built for Pharaoh. Great cities, great monuments, achievements. And then there's the stories about terrible plagues, about an amazing escape. They have escaped Egypt, but they haven't escaped the part that Egypt plays in who they are. There are other stories that go back further. And maybe it's easier for these guys to identify with Abraham. Abraham, the wanderer. Abraham who left the land of his fathers and came to Canaan. And God said to Abraham at Canaan, "To your offspring I will give this land," at a place called Shechem. Shechem is right in the heart of Canaan. It's kind of halfway between Nazareth and Jerusalem. And I don't want to spoil the ending, but there's a big story arc here. And by the time we get to the end of Joshua, we're going to be back at Shechem. With Abraham, we come around again to the question of circumcision. Now I have to say I was surprised when I started reading to find that even within the local world of the Israelites at this time, circumcision wasn't at all unique to the Israelites. The Egyptians had a form of circumcision, and names like the Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, biblical peoples who all had in their history some form of circumcision in their ritual practice. So we could see this as God using an element familiar to Abraham, to the Israelites, to explain something about himself. Similar in some ways to what we see with Pattina's ministry to the ethnic Thai, where she's using elements of the local culture, or perhaps the way early Christians used solstice to tell the story of Christmas. But whatever the origin of the ritual of circumcision, for the Israelites at this time crossing into Canaan, the association is very strongly with Abraham, and with specifically the covenant that Abraham made with God. God said to Abraham, "You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. For the generations to come, every male among you must be circumcised." 11.5 years ago, I stood up here and Rachel and I formalised a covenant relationship when we got married. There's a lot of things that go on in a wedding, but the heart of it, there's a set of promises that we made to each other, and there's an exchange of rings which happens, which is a symbol, and it's a reminder of those promises and that covenant that we made. 3.5 years ago, I stood up here again. I gave my testimony before I went to get baptised. And the common thing here is it's a public acknowledgement of a relationship, of a commitment, and there's a symbol. With baptism, it's the symbol of water for death and new life. Now, the ring and the water, they're not magical, and they're not even really necessary to the covenant. Wearing a ring doesn't keep me married. Only commitment to Rachel does that. And going for a swim, it's not going to make you a Christian. But there's something powerful about that kind of public statement about doing something concrete that can really spiritually and psychologically, it's powerful. And that, I think, is the role that circumcision plays in the covenant for Abraham and the covenant for the Israelites. It's a bit more drastic than putting on a ring, but it is a symbol, and it's all about their commitment to a role in a relationship as God's people. And so the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." It's an amazing moment because they're no longer identified as escaped slaves. They're no longer identified by their time in Egypt. They're starting fresh, and their identity is as God's people. Now, I think I do need to address briefly, if circumcision was part of Abraham's covenant with God, and we worship Abraham's God, why aren't we circumcising? Why is that not something we do? And it was a very serious question for the early church. We were looking last month in RBT at Acts, and because I was reading up about this, it was very obvious to me. Every second chapter, they're talking about circumcision, arguing about it. And there was a very real question about whether they should be continuing that practice. If I could refer you to one book of the Bible to kind of fully answer the question, it would be Galatians, where Paul really goes into this in detail. But I'll share with you just Galatians chapter 5, verse 6, where he says, "In Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love." And that is the heart of it, isn't it? As if there's no relationship, if there's no faith, if there's no love, what good is the covenant? If you have the relationship, the covenant, it's crystallising a set of ideas about who we are and about how we relate to each other. It's not always going to be, it's not going to mean the same thing in every set of circumstances, but the identity is consistent. With regard to Rachel, I'll always be her husband. For richer, for poorer, for better, for worse. It means different things, but it's always as a husband. God said to Abraham, "I will be their God. They will be my people." And there's an echo of that idea. It's a deep intention to be that person, to take on that identity. For the Israelites crossing into Canaan, they're looking back at the promises, of course, that God made to Abraham and identifying themselves with that. They're claiming those promises. But it's not just a history lesson. It's a vow. They're declaring intent. You will be our God, and we will be your people. At Cardiff Heights, is that our vow? Is that our intention? What do those words mean for us? How do you identify yourself? If someone sits down with you and says, "Tell me about yourself," what are the things that are on your mind? It's probably going to be some covenants or commitments on that list. Commitments to family, to career, be things you've done, things you intend to do. And for most of us here this morning, one of those commitments is to God. And if we have that covenant relationship with God, it defines something about our identity. And this is where the marriage metaphor starts to really break down. Because I might joke that Rachel's always right. She is usually. But if you're in a relationship with God, He's always right. And so, for this part of our identity, what matters is actually, what does God say about you? Are there things that God would say about you that you wouldn't dare to say about you? Are there promises that God has made that you aren't yet willing to claim? Has God made plans for you that you haven't yet faced? I've found that when God calls us to things, He's had them penciled in for us a long time before we get there. It takes me a while to get the message and a fair bit longer to accept it. It could mean a lot of different things. Maybe it's a shift in family role. Maybe it's a shift in role in the church, a career change, a church plant. Whatever it is, we don't have to do it all in one go. We're not called to just march up and take Jericho. But we are required to declare our intent. If you want to be in that covenant relationship with God, we have to have that intention to keep taking those steps. There's a song we've been singing in evening services that it's been on my mind. And there's a repeated line that says, "I am who you say I am." I'm going to ask for that to be put up in a moment on the screen. And I'd encourage you as it's playing, to use the time to just sit and reflect on who it is that you say you are and who it is that God says you are. And if there's a misalignment there, don't go and get circumcised. But maybe there is something that is concrete, that is a symbol that you could do to get yourself back into step with God. Thanks.